So this guy, his name's Chris, and Chris has a problem. He's in love with someone who's quite literally half his age. Now, Chris has a great life. He's a former rugby player, but he's retired from that and he now works as a high school PE teacher. But then one day, Chris gets a little crush on this girl. The girl is a student at the school he teaches at. We'll just call her Student. Now, at this time, Chris is about 30 years old, while Student is 16. Oh, but it gets worse. Chris is obsessed with Student. He's always leaving little love notes in her bag, asking her out on dates. He's asking her to come over and babysit his kids, like as an excuse to see her. So eventually, Chris and Student, they start secretly dating. And they start getting intimate. And it's gross. And after this has been going on a while, Student starts having trouble at home, like with her parents and stuff. So Chris asks her to move in with him and be his full-time live-in babysitter. And she does. Here's the thing though. Chris is actually married. Like he already has a wife who lives with him. And we'll just call her Wife. And Wife is totally fine with a live-in babysitter at first because she doesn't know that Chris and Student are smashing. But then she starts to figure out what's going on. And she doesn't like it one bit. So she kicks Student out of her house. And that pisses Chris off, so Chris and Wife, they start fighting about this a lot. It's a whole mess. And poor Wife, she loves Chris so much, she tries everything she can to keep their family together. But it seems like nothing is gonna fix their broken relationship because Chris is still obsessed with Student. And while Wife is trying to work everything out and fix her marriage, Chris comes up with a plan to end this love triangle once and for all. Now, the details of exactly how Chris does this are unclear, but one night he allegedly takes his wife to the coast north of the city they live in, and there he unalives her and he disposes of the body. Then he goes back home and pretends like nothing happened. He just tells everyone that, well, Wife got fed up with everything and she just left town and abandoned him and her own kids, which is something Wife would never do. The very next day, after he unalives Wife, he moves Student into his house permanently. She's still 16, by the way. Then weeks go by and Wife's family and her friends are like, where's Wife? She wouldn't just abandon her kids. This is all very suspicious. And after about 6 weeks and all this public pressure, Chris has no choice. He finally reports Wife missing. He literally tells police that she probably ran away and joined a religious cult. Anyway, 2 years go by and Chris officially marries Student, because now she's 18. And to make it worse, the wedding ring he gives her was actually Wife's wedding ring, with the stones reset. So Chris and Student are now married, and they're making it work. And it seems like Chris went ahead and got away with murder. Until, after 9 years of marriage, Chris and Student get a divorce. And he must have pissed her off, because the second they divorce, Student goes to police and is like, I don't actually have proof, but I'm pretty sure Chris unalived his wife all those years ago. You should look into it. And police and prosecutors, they kind of look into it, but unfortunately the state ultimately concludes that there's just not enough evidence to prove that Chris did anything. But from then on, every few years, prosecutors and police, they try something new to get more information to solve the case. They're calling in new witnesses, they're offering rewards for any new information. They even call in a special task force, the Unsolved Homicide Unit, and they start investigating. But still, they don't have enough evidence. And that is where this guy comes in. We'll just call him Head. And Head is an investigative journalist, and he's been following this case for years. And at this point in the timeline, 36 years have passed since Wife first went missing. But Head doesn't care. He wants to look into this case. So he goes to his bosses at the newspaper, and he pitches this to do as a story. And he wants to do it as a podcast so he can go in depth. And his bosses give him the green light. Sure, you can do your podcast. So then Head gets his team together, and he gets to work. He's interviewing people, he's gathering documents, and tons of evidence. And after 6 months of investigating, he finally finishes his research. And he releases the first couple of episodes of the podcast. And the series blows up, because this case is compelling. People are way into it. The episodes are downloaded like 30 million times or something, depending on how you measure. And the case is suddenly in the zeitgeist, and now there's a ton of public interest in it. And suddenly, people start contacting Head, and they're coming forward with new evidence and new information. And he's not even done putting all the episodes of the podcast out yet. So Head keeps having to add all this new information to his podcast in real time. He was originally only supposed to do 8 episodes, but because of all this new information people keep bringing him, he ends up doing 17. So it's a big hit. And around that time, that special task force that had started investigating all those years before, they finally conclude their investigation. And allegedly, due to the interest created from Head's podcast, and due to that special task force, they now have enough evidence to charge Chris with Wife's murder. And after 36 years, Chris is finally arrested. And he goes to trial, and Student shows up, and she testifies against him, and Chris is ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 24 years in prison. And all this happened in Australia, so shout out to Australia. So one day, this woman is in the office at work, and she works in one of those tall sky-rise buildings at a banking company. And then suddenly, a full-sized commercial airplane flies right into the building. boom. And it's a horrible scene. People are screaming, things are on fire, there are hurt people everywhere, and this woman needs to get out of the building fast. But she can't, because she's hurt bad, and she's only half conscious. And as she's laying there, the only thing she can think about in this horrible moment is the thought of her fiancé, this guy, Big Dave, and how they're about to be married, and she wants nothing more than to make it through this so that she can walk down the aisle with him. And as she's lying there, fading, she's suddenly approached by a mysterious guy in a red bandana. And he puts out the flames on her clothing, and he pulls her up, and he leads her to the only safe staircase in the building. So there she is. She makes it out alive. And 6 days later, she wakes up in a hospital burn unit. Now, her name's Tanya, and Tanya has somehow survived the September 11th attacks. And if the attacks weren't bad enough, she then gets some terrible news. Her fiancé, Big Dave, who wasn't with her that day because he was working in another building, the North Tower, that tower also got hit by a plane. And Big Dave didn't survive. And Tanya is devastated, and she's crushed, and she goes through long periods of grief and pain, and eventually she ends up connecting with another 9/11 survivor. That survivor introduces her to an online group he founded called the Survivors Network. So Tanya joins the group, and they love her story, and she quickly becomes very active in there. She volunteers as a tour guide at the 9/11 Memorial, where she can share her story with tourists, and soon she's giving tours to the mayor and the governor of New York. And Tanya's smart. She went to Harvard and Stanford, so she uses her big brain and works her way up and eventually becomes president of the Survivors Network. And the group is thriving under her direction. I mean, clearly Tanya has made the best of this tragedy. I mean, at this point, there's no stopping her. Until 6 years go by, and a couple of journalists at the New York Times reach out to Tanya. Now, I don't know what these journalists look like, but we'll just represent them both with this character, NYT. So NYT reaches out to her because he's doing a story on the 5-year anniversary of 9/11, and Tanya agrees. She'll do the interview. But then, strangely, she cancels and reschedules. Then she cancels again and reschedules again, and then again and again and again. Then she starts avoiding NYT and blocking his calls. So NYT gets suspicious, and he starts fact-checking her story. First, he contacts Harvard and Stanford, but they have no record of Tanya ever attending. He contacts the banking company in the building she was working at that day. That company had never heard of Tanya. So NYT keeps digging, and he finds that not only was Tanya not in the building that day on 9/11, she wasn't even in the country. She was in Barcelona, Spain, where she's from. And her fiancé, this guy Big Dave? Big Dave is actually a real guy. This is his photo. And he unfortunately really did pass away on 9/11. But according to his family, he didn't have a fiancé, and he never knew Tanya. And the mysterious guy in the red bandana who rescued her? Also a real person. And he really did quite famously rescue a lot of people that day. But he didn't rescue Tanya, because Tanya wasn't there. She made it all up. She found stories about people who really did die in 9/11, and she worked herself into those stories. So NYT's piece on the 5th anniversary of 9/11 suddenly becomes a story all about Tanya. And he writes the story, and about a week later, he publishes it. And the story blows up. Like, other news outlets are picking it up, and people see it, and they're shocked, and they're like, damn, she lied about everything. Is her name really even Tanya? Apparently. No, her name's actually Alicia. Now, to be clear, they can't really arrest Tanya for lying about being in 9/11. She didn't technically break any laws. There's no record of her stealing any money. But unfortunately for her, the Survivors Network didn't like her lying to everyone. And they got pissed off, and they kicked her out of the group and removed her as president. And I guess after that, she was humiliated because she suddenly disappeared and went back to live in Spain. But then, 2 years later, the Survivors Network gets an email. That email was informing them that Tanya was so impacted by the backlash from all this that she had recently, sadly, unalived herself. And that turned out to be a lie too. She didn't unalive herself. She's still very much alive to this day, living in Barcelona. Shout out to New York and Spain.